Welcome to American Medieval, a podcast about the fact that if the United States has never been truly modern, it's probably because we've always been a little bit medieval. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I've been researching, teaching, and talking about the Middle Ages, well, to anyone who will listen at least, for more than 3 decades. Each week on the show, we'll be joined by an expert scholar who'll share their fascination with, and sometimes their revulsion by, both the medieval world itself as well as the ways the historical period has been remembered and used right here in the USA. Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of American Medieval. I am Professor Matthew Gabriele, and I am excited because I am joined today by Ada Kuskowski, who is an associate professor in the Department of History at the University of Pennsylvania. Her book, Vernacular Law, Writing and the Reinvention of Customary Law in Medieval France, was published by Cambridge University Press in 2022, and her research interests more generally focus on legal culture and thought in France and the Mediterranean during the Middle Ages. And we are going to talk, I think, a little bit later on today about the medieval F word, feudalism. But before we get to that, Ada, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Matt. I look forward to this discussion.
Fantastic. All right. Excited. All right. Before we get to the medieval F word, which I just like saying because it implies something kind of scandalous about this. And maybe there is something kind of scandalous about talking about feudalism here in the 21st century. But we on the podcast like to start with, I hope you'll indulge me, kind of a silly question. And maybe it's not silly, I don't know, but it involves time machines. Because I think that we all have to deal with, anybody who studies the past really, gets asked a question about time machines at some point in their career. Our time machine, however, is a little bit different. It is a single-use time machine, there and back, so you don't have to stay anywhere. But the time machine has a caveat on it, and that can only be used for one purpose and one time. And that one purpose is we have to go back into the past, and Ada, you have to go visit a younger version of yourself and tell them that they will grow up someday to be a medieval historian. How do they react to that news?
Sorry.
No.
I suppose they laugh like I just did.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah. There's your young self may love history, but also grows up in a more or less immigrant household thinking that's not an actual profession. So to all the young people out there, I want to say it can be. You never know whether it will be. And sometimes you have to take a chance on the thing you would like to do, and it works out. So that's what I'd like to tell my younger self.
Okay, fantastic. Do you think young Ada would be excited that they're studying the Middle Ages, or was this kind of outside the realm of possibility? Because I think, when I've been asking this to all the guests who have been joining us, and a lot of people say, and myself, medieval historian, that's a thing you could do, so it was kind of outside the realm of possibility until some people it was high school or some experience in college or something like that. Was it similar for you, or did you always have a sense that you liked or were interested at least in the medieval world?
So actually my love of history began with the ancient world. As a young person, my very favorite thing to read was Asterix and Obelix, and I thought that was the most fascinating thing in the world. It was much later that I discovered the Middle Ages. It was in college. And the thing that I loved most about it is that the things I was supposed to be thinking about it, the things that I had learned, were not actually the things that characterized it. And in fact, it was both itself and its opposite. And that was so interesting to me that is where I stayed.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. Yeah, that's a pretty common response too, is that some people start kind of later, maybe in early modernity or something like that, and get kind of pulled backwards towards the Middle Ages. And then there's a fair number of people who start out in classics or ancient history. That's their interest. And then they kind of get pulled forward or something like that. The reality too is that I think, for many of us, it's just some, like you were saying, right? Some formative experience in college, some professor, some class, it just really kind of sparked something oh, this is really, I want to know more kind of about that, but I think it's really neat to hear kind of the different kind of paths that people can take, because it is we were talking just for a minute kind of before we started recording, is that in the United States, at least, education before college does not really touch on the Middle Ages kind of a whole lot. Like it's just this kind of blank space. You might get, there's this fall of Rome thing. Everything got real bad for a while. And then we're going to jump and like, oh, look, this glorious art or the Reformation or something like that. So it moves very quickly past this period that we're often kind of find ourselves kind of drawn to.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find that true of like your students as well? That
Absolutely.
they don't know a whole lot about it. So like, I guess kind of my question there would be so, among the many courses that they can take, like they chose something with a medieval topic in a history department. Like, do you have a sense of kind of what draws them to it if they're not getting it from, a classroom?
Mm-hmm. Well, I do ask them because I am curious about it. And a common answer I get is, I didn't know anything about it, so I kind of wanted to learn a little more. So they recognize, they notice, I think, that there's this 1,000 years between their knowledge of the Roman world and the age of exploration. And they wonder a little bit, like, what's that millennium of connective tissue?
Yeah.
So, and that's like the most fun answer. Sometimes the answer is it fit my schedule, but then you snatch them.
Fair enough. Yeah.
Whatever brings them into the classroom is fine. But sometimes it'll be some of my colleagues I have a colleague who teaches a class on American legal history, and she talks about Magna Carta, and they get curious. There's actually like lots of ways in which that period is so formative, but we see it in these tiny little instances, tiny little mentions. But as soon as students start thinking about, wow, that was 700 years ago, and it relates to today, then they get a little curious.
Yeah. Yeah. There's always, and that's part of the inspiration, obviously, for starting the podcast is the various weird ways in which the medieval kind of pops up into American culture, right?
Mm-hmm.
In all sorts of ways, that be it politics or pop culture or, legal history. Birthright citizenship has been talking about medieval English common law for, the last, several months, and that's been a really kind of live topic. Bizarrely, for lots of different reasons. But, as you were saying, I've really been interested in, because I do the same thing, of course, too, in my classes. And I get more of the kind of the pop culture stuff, like, I played a video game. I read a lot of Tolkien or other fantasy stuff, but it's nice that it's always like you were saying, like this curiosity is like, I see the blank space there and like, what is the thing that's happening there? And anything we can do to foster that. Not that, my students or our students are listening to podcasts or anything like that, but maybe they are. Who knows? Anyway, all right. So, we brought you here to talk a little bit about the medieval F word, about feudalism, because I think that, that's been one of the most requested kind of topics as, people have offered kind of feedback as we've been doing the podcast. And, not that the podcast has been going on for a long time, just a few months now. But I think it's one of those things, like you were saying about kind of like Magna Carta, it's something that people have heard, but there's not a great kind of understanding of it. So maybe we could start, if you don't mind, kind of at that, like kind of the 10,000 feet level, like what is this term feudalism? Like how do people understand it? And then like, is it a thing as far as medievalists are concerned? Just a small question.
It's just a small question.
Yeah.
Let me take the next few weeks to answer it.
Yeah.
So, I think people have questions because historians also have questions, right? Like we have also had a very lively debate about what this thing is over the last at least 50-something years.
Sure.
And at one level, it means something in popular culture. It means something about, I suppose, chivalry and economic inequality, systems of hierarchy, kind of vague things like that get attached to this idea. So when you say something's feudal today, it might be anything at any time period, but it has some of these characteristics. The word itself is a coinage of Adam Smith, who was trying to describe an economy that wasn't driven by market forces, but driven by like force, coercion, exploitation. And that, of course, becomes a theory developed by Marx to describe stages of history and especially stages of economic development. So, going from slave to feudal to modern. And I think the word modern is really key. So feudalism is really important to the last, say, 250 years of history because it explains us to ourselves. And I think that's where it's the most useful, actually. Separately, it's used to explain medieval history in really important ways. And we can talk about the problems and kind of assets of that. But most importantly, it became an ism in an age that described things in isms because it did something for our understanding of our modern selves.
Yeah. So Adam Smith, notoriously not living in the Middle Ages, decides that this is the best way to kind of look back upon the past. And lots of people, for historians and scholars in the modern period, have looked back and kind of tried to describe this kind of general thing that they've taken, but it seems to be kind of the way that it's understood now, and not necessarily, I mean, also somewhat in within medieval studies, but certainly people who are thinking about the Middle Ages from outside, is it seems to be kind of this all-encompassing thing, right? Like, is that, do you think, kind of a product of kind of these canonical Western thinkers in some ways, like Smith and Marx and stuff like that? Or is there something actually there in the Middle Ages that leads people to continue to use this term?
Oh, well, that's an interesting question and a really long one, complicated. But so, I mean, of course, there was something there that was used and expanded to create totalizing concept for society. I mean, that's the thing about feudalism that makes it different from capitalism or democracy, right? Feudalism was understood to be, the way that the term was used up until the 1970s, was feudalism was a legal system. It was an economic system. It was a social system. It was a cultural system. Okay. It was a political system. It was all these things. And that was a bit of the problem, right? Like, because it was actually understood very differently depending on which of those topics one was talking about. But it was a blanket term that meant any of those things. And then periodization was also an issue. The when of feudalism. I mean, was it around the year 1000? Was it from the end of Rome until the age of exploration? Was it somewhere in the 9th century? Was it the lawyer's invention of the 12th and 13th century?
Yeah.
And so these are debates that historians have. But I think if you can't really peg when it happened, and if you're talking about different things when you're trying to describe what it was, it creates a bit of an issue for describing historical fact. So there's things there that you can identify, but there's also things that you could identify that are not part of what we think of as feudalism.
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of, my own research oftentimes kind of deals with religious violence. And so this term crusade, which is often used, which is, again, like an anachronism, it's a modern creation, or at least an early modern creation at being generous with the period. But it seems to be, when people were using it, and I correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems to be this is what you're saying, is that, or at least as I'm understanding it, is that everybody was using different definitions when they were saying the term, but they all assumed that they were talking about the same thing.
Yes. And this kind of linchpin moment I keep referring to is an article by Elizabeth A.R. Brown called The Tyranny of a Construct, where she kind of exploded the concept by discussing, right, this fact that we're discussing now, which is the different ways in which people use the term. So part of it was the lawyers were discussing it one way, the economists another way, but then they assumed kind of the sameness outside of their own field. And then the other part of it was that, you could say feudal society, and then you knew what things you were looking for when you were evaluating society. They had to be the feudal things. So, whether it was a certain kind of land dependency, lord-vassal relationships, agrarian exploitation, right? So you had to find those things. And then you showed it was kind of a circular thing. You were looking for a feudal society and you found one, right? You couldn't find things outside of it. That was not your research question.
Right. So these scholars, in some ways, of the early 20th century, let's say kind of generally, or the late 19th century, is that they're going looking for a thing, and if you go looking for a thing, you're going to find the thing. Like you're gonna make the evidence kind of conform in some way, so that everything outside of it, you just say that that's not the parameters within which I'm interested, and so everything seems to kind of fit within this neat model.
Yeah. And especially, I mean, I think the 19th century is a little bit less a part of the story than it should be, in the sense that, so it's not only like Marx and Capital and these things, but Also, the 19th century is the moment of creation of the disciplines. I mean, it's a moment of the creation of history, of economics, of political science. And each of the disciplines had different reasons for looking back into the past to understand their own contemporary world. And that's a little bit why this, governance systems of the Middle Ages took on different forms depending on who was talking about them. Because they were, one group was trying to understand the economy and how it worked, another the state and how it worked, the other the law and how it worked, and so on. And so you're looking for different things, but you're using the same word, and suddenly everything bleeds in together and it becomes an entity in and of itself.
Yeah. No, it creates itself kind of almost, right? Like when that happens is that you have a bunch of disciplines, and then there's a critical mass within the scholarship in which everybody's kind of using the term, and then these people train people, and then, it just kind of self-perpetuates. So what is it, you mentioned, Peggy Brown's, Elizabeth Brown's article from 1970, was it?
1974.
74. So 1974, like the tyranny of a construct. Like what impact did that ultimately have in kind of disabusing scholars of this kind of idea? Because, as I said kind of at the beginning, like it's still kind of out there, like, in popular culture, not just in popular culture, but in other disciplines as well, like still kind of using this term oftentimes. If that was published I'm not a math major, so 52 years ago, I guess it is. Why do you think we're still kind of talking about this?
Well, let me start with medieval historians and then zoom outwards.
Sure.
For medieval historians, when she first wrote this article, I think there were early adopters and there were people who were like, no, feudalism exists.
Okay.
And so it created a big debate in the field, which I think that was for a decade or two. But now we're at a place where most professional medieval historians almost never use that term. They might use feudal to describe a kind of land or a lord-vassal relationship, but they'll never say feudalism. So it has had a big impact on medieval history, and I can say a little bit more about how medieval historians have reconceptualized how we see kind of government, social structures in the wake of all of that. I think the reason that it survives in more modern history and in other fields of history is that, it's the linchpin. So modernity is a contrast to medievalism, right? You can't have, French Revolution overthrew feudal structures, albeit like ones that are characteristically 18th century and not like 13th century.
Yeah.
But the French Revolution overthrows feudal structures in order to create modernity. Similarly, America, overthrows the English empire and the king and primogeniture and all of the stuff that was kind of seen as feudal in order to create its own modernity. And so that is how people at the time understood it. But we've understood some of those concepts as mapping back into history. But I think it's incredibly useful and incredibly entrenched. Since the 19th century, How do you talk about capitalism without talking about the thing that it sprung from, which of course is feudalism, even though you'll find any number of medieval works talking about how, serfdom coexisted with slavery in some places and coexisted with wage labor. All of those things are happening at the same time.
Yeah.
But one of the big things that the feudalism debate turns around is pedagogy and education. Right? So how do you explain complex things to people?
Sure.
And there are different views on this. Some people say we need these concepts in order to, you think medieval, you can think feudalism, and that's easy and good. And other people who say that's neither easy nor good, because then you have to unteach that stuff in order to tell them like real history.
Yeah.
And so a lot of it turns about like what kind of information we think people can handle. And I think I'm of the camp that I think it's okay to say that something is complicated and that many things were happening at the same time. And in fact, like that's the interesting thing about the medieval period. It's this period between two ages of empire where all of these things, all of these potentialities are existing, and some aspects of what you might call modernity, a term coined in the 12th century, emerge from that, but it held all of those things. It held different kinds of futures, right? So if early modern European empires are characterized by slave systems, they could have also been characterized, by republican traditions from the Italian city-states. They could have also been they could have been characterized by many different things. And Middle Ages held all of that, which I think is the cool thing. So I think we should teach it that way.
Okay. Yeah. I love what you just said about potentialities, like the medieval as an age of potentialities, because and that example at the end was so evocative, because there are democratic or at least republican traditions, embedded within the Middle Ages. There are systems of kind of egregious inequalities, as you were saying, that are there as well. And it wasn't necessarily going to the case that it was always going to happen, turn out the way it did. But, the simplification of something does oftentimes lead to some really kind of problematic things that you have to unteach kind of later on. Uh-huh. I'm thinking about kind of my own pedagogy and how I teach an intro course versus how I teach like an upper level undergraduate course or a graduate seminar or something like that. Those are very different, but it is oftentimes very easy to kind of latch on to those very simplified versions. So if we are complicating things then, mm-hmm. which I'm 100% in agreement that we should complicate things, because I think messiness is really interesting, is if you were teaching about, your primary research, is legal history. So how would you teach about kind of legal culture within the Middle Ages, in which you would kind of break down this category of feudalism to talk about like how relations actually worked in the medieval period?
I don't think I would start by explaining feudalism and taking it apart. That's actually not what I do in my class, though I do at some point have to get to the fact of the pyramid, right? That is, if anybody knows one thing, they know there's a pyramid with a king at the top and then vassals, the clergy, people at the bottom. And the pyramid is kind of a useful way to start, in a sense, mostly because that political structure does not actually capture how medieval politics and law worked.
Sure.
So if you look at a pyramid like that, you think that the king is all powerful, very, very powerful. But, for instance, in my research, I look at customary law, which is what? It's law that's derived from practice. So you look at what people do and you start deriving legal rules from that. I think people are surprised to know how little legislation there was, say, in the early 13th century. Most of legal practice was informal, oral, performed, like all of these different things. It was not a legislated practice.
Yeah.
So how is that king at the top? He's not a lawmaker in the way that sovereignty theorists will think of that kind of power in the 16th century onwards, or the way that the modern state is characterized, right? It has a monopoly over law. Well, the medieval king did not. So that's one way of thinking about it. The other way of thinking about it is plural jurisdiction. So the king at the top makes you think that royal courts and royal power is the most important thing, but ecclesiastical courts, church courts were just as important. And they had separate spheres of jurisdiction. But of course, when those first start being discussed, they're not like that clearly mapped out. So a lot of the earliest records of the Parliament of Paris, for instance, are debates about jurisdiction, like the king and various ecclesiastics debating over who gets jurisdiction over what. That's one of the big political debates, of course, of the period, right? Who is on top of who is more powerful, the secular rulers or the popes, one of the big medieval debates. You can't see that in the pyramid. And then the other things you can't see is, of course, merchants, the various courts they had at fairs and so on. So you can't see informal methods of dispute resolution, something that we've recognized as incredibly important, especially until the 13th century.
Yeah.
And indeed, the first law books of the 13th century tell judicial officers to first try to informally resolve things before people go to courts. So those are some ways in which, I teach what I call legal culture, right? So different modes of doing law by different forms of authority, how those forms of authority interacted. The scholars call this pluralism, right? So different layers of courts, different courts for different people. So if we zoom to, say, the Kingdom of Jerusalem and the Crusader states, There were different kinds of courts for the Latin Christian nobility, different kind of courts for burgesses, and mostly Jews or Muslims living there were left to their own devices unless they had a dispute with a Christian, and then they were embroiled in these Christian courts.
Yeah.
But, again, none of that is reflected in the pyramid, so a good reason for checking it.
Yeah. No, it seems like, I mean, like you're talking about, like all these kind of overlapping, sometimes parallel, sometimes kind of overlapping, spheres of jurisdiction and, different types of cultures. And this is generalizing too. And I mean, I don't, please correct me if I'm wrong, but like it's generalizing too about the entirety of a 1,000-year period across an entire continent, actually several continents, if we talk about kind of North Africa and, a little bit of the Eastern Roman Empire or something like that. Like, then you have all these different kind of things going on, and which things can change over time, and it can change, even within, the spheres of influence that a king or an aristocrat might have, depending upon the power that they're able to kind of wield within their jurisdiction, right? Like things could very much change. The Capetian kings of France, for example, right? Like they don't have a lot of power, for quite a long time, right? But then they start to really have quite a bit of power, but the extent of that power really kind of depends. And this is just kind of within the legal sphere, right? Because we're also, as you were talking about kind of politics and, that feudalism supposedly encompasses, but it also encompasses kind of economics and politics as well. So it gets really, really messy really quick.
I will say, though, just before we leave the legal sphere, that it is true and a fact that there was a form of property called the fief that existed, based on mutual obligations owed from a lord to his man, who could also be a woman, depending on where and when. You asked earlier about, like, how do we get this idea? It's because the fief does exist, but it's not the only way of property holding. And property holding is one part of law and not all of it. So the medieval theorization of the fief occurs in the 12th century. Lawyers try to figure out this kind of property. And they're doing it at a time where various books of Roman law are being studied as well. And these books are talking about ownership and they're talking about possession. So I think those are modes of property that exist. But the one that was untheorized until the 12th century was the fief. And so I think that was a bit the mistake, right? So there's this new thing called the law of fiefs, and people understood that as being the only kind of law, forgetting that, like, if you look at law books, university law books, you have the Roman law, ownership, possession, and these different modes of holding things that we would think of as modern and non-feudal, alongside this kind of property. So that's, the law version of the picture.
Yeah. No, and again, like in all these kind of different ways of understanding kind of the relationship to property and by extension, kind of the relationship to kind of authority within that as well. And they could exist, as you were saying, kind of side by side and, kind of depending upon the different relationships that two people might often have. And like, as you've said, like most of the examples that you've given just so far, right? Like we're talking about kind of the later Middle Age or like the high or later Middle Ages, right? So we're leaving off that whole kind of early bit of stuff in which there were very different relations between kind of people and property and hierarchy and authority and stuff like that. And this is kind of a long-winded way of saying is that one of the things that, scholars often talk about is that there's some sort of kind of transformation in the way that this happens. There's kind of, this, we don't need to go into it, but kind of these waves of debate about kind of the transformation of the year 1000, or some people have pushed it to 1100 or something like that. So could you just talk just very briefly maybe about, because before we get to the 12th century, like, are we talking about anything kind of similar to what we will see in the later Middle Ages, or is this really kind of a different world entirely as well?
Well, I am going to answer for myself, but then I want to hear from you as a specialist of the earlier period. So here goes a view from what happens after, and then I want to hear from you.
Yeah.
But, I think, so there's a double answer. I mean, when we were mentioning, the birth of the disciplines and how they look back to the past. One of the big questions was, how did the Roman Empire lead to a feudal world, right? So the question is, when you start seeing land ownership change from large estates with slaves to smaller plots with serfs, and how that looks in different parts of the post-Roman Empire. And probably, I think, well, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but my impression is that Chris Wickham's framing of the Middle Ages is still kind of very foundational in the sense that he was comparative, but also looked at material culture into thinking, to thinking about why we call something feudal. So that's one way of answering. At the same time, I feel like this is the answer with any time we talk about feudal things. It depends on the subject you're looking at. Because if I think of the legal history and I think of François Ganshoff, if you just look at the legal sources, then, well, it depends, right? It depends. And again, if you just look at the legal sources, it also depends on your views. I suppose that I'm more of a line of the slow mutation than dramatic revolution, but happy to debate. And part of it is, I think French scholar Dominique Barthélémy makes a really convincing argument, him and many others, that we have a change in documentary culture and also a change in discursive culture. So people are talking about things like violence in order to achieve things at court, but not because society has necessarily become like so dramatically more violent than it was 50 years earlier, 50 years later. And there has been a true shift, I think, when people think about the legal changes of that period. Like one of the big changes is documentary culture. And one of the things that should tell us about historians is that, the story can change when we know more about a period, when we look at documents more accurately. So when we start thinking about complaints of churchmen, who are complaining of violence and being dispossessed, and we realize that, or evil customs, Richard Barton, Steve White, Tracy Bilodeau, when they're talking about those things, they're using it to achieve certain results, rather than like coolly and neutrally describe a reality. They're political actors and they want stuff. So that's a bit the gambit. So I think I prefer to think of it as kind of, it doesn't mean that there wasn't a change, right? Like the year 800 looks different from the year 1200. And of course, there are like violent invasions. So that is a bit of a fact. But some of the theories we had were really kind of taking sources at their face value rather than thinking like, what are they doing? Why are they doing it? And so on, which for the students listening is the critical toolkit you get when studying the Middle Ages.
That's right. Yes, a skeptic's eye at the very least. So no, I think this makes a lot of sense to me. And I was always, because I was always, I started out back in grad school, maybe even like before kind of, when I was started to get interested in the Middle Ages, because I worked with the late Daniel Callahan at the University of Delaware, who worked on kind of 11th century kind of monastic culture, but also kind of ideas of apocalypse. And so this idea of kind of revolution and this idea of the terrors of the year 1000, which very seamlessly seemed to merge with this kind of feudal transformation, or the so-called feudal transformation of the period. And it always just seemed to me that like, it's really seductive to think about radical transformation as kind of a moment, and this goes back to, Haskin's Renaissance of the 12th century and stuff like that, and even well beyond, scholarship kind of well beyond, before that as well. But I tend to be in agreement with you, is that we can see that, as you were saying, 800 is different than 1200, but things change slowly over time, and we have to be very specific about where and when we're talking about too, because Aquitaine is just different than Saxony, which is very different than, kind of across the channel in England. And there's lots of reasons for that. And so we should be splitting maybe more often than we're lumping. And I say that as someone who likes kind of big narratives in a lot of my writing and stuff like that. But when we're talking about kind of these bigger ideas about how power relates to one another, how land is kind of distributed and organized, and how social classes kind of interact with one another, and we're mostly kind of talking, as we have been, about kind of upper class people. Like, we got to remember there's lots of other people kind of out there as well too. Like, it's really difficult to say sometimes kind of how, kind of what's specifically happening and why things are changing. we're stuck, as you said, with the sources that we have. But you're
I didn't quite say that.
yeah, well, but those sources oftentimes are trying to tell us a particular type of story, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we have to kind of read through them sometimes.
Yeah.
Although I'm very tall in real life, I still love tiny things, like our sibling show on Multitude, Tiny Matters. Tiny Matters talks about how science shapes every facet of our lives, and especially how tiny things from molecules to microbes can have a big and oftentimes surprising impact on society. Former scientists Sam Jones and Debalki Chakravarti will lead you through some of the answers to your burning questions, such as, can we resurrect an extinct species? And if so, should we? Jurassic Park turned out fine, right? Tiny Matters is sponsored by the American Chemical Society, a nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C., and produced by Multitude. New episodes every Wednesday, wherever you listen to your pods.
I think larger narratives are important.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the field has moved a lot in the direction of, textured local histories that explain why something changed in one place a certain way as compared to another. That is very important.
Yeah.
At the same time, though, we have to place medieval history, the 1,000 years, the millennium, with the bookends of Roman history and early modern empire. And so there has to be a way to do that. At the same time, it doesn't have to be monocausal, right? I mean, so that answer can have like 3 different parts because, again, it is 1,000 years. It is, a continent plus a Mediterranean plus, the ambit of what we think of as a medieval world has also changed. The global Middle Ages has changed, seeing an interconnected world, thinking of the Mongols and the Mamluks. And, there's a lot of change that has happened simply because we stopped, focusing on, say, largely France and England and mapping their developments onto everybody else, And so that's really kind of the maturity of the field. And it's become very exciting. It does mean it's become a bit more complicated, but, you can start with that and give it a few characteristics. And then if people want to learn more, they can. I think that's possible.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the 1,000-year thing is like that oftentimes blows my students' mind. I mean, it blows my mind sometimes to think about too. It's just like, why would we expect the beginning of the period that we call the European Middle Ages to be the same as the period that, like the end of that period as well? Like if that's over 1,000 years and it, leaving aside kind of difference of geography or anything like that, because, the United States as it exists in 2026 is not the same as North America was in the year 1026. It's quite different. Like that's the same 1,000 years, right? And we can't assume that, just because, we're modern and, we're very different than everything else, that things wouldn't have changed in the past as well. So I'm wondering, I want to talk about something that you mentioned kind of early on, is about the construction of this idea of feudalism as a way of kind of talking about modernity in a lot of ways, kind of what came after. But I want to go back, back into the Middle Ages just for a moment too, is that, if we are talking about this idea of fiefs, like you said, there is a thing called a fief, and that is a real thing and that we know, some stuff about, is that how would that kind of work? Like, just taking kind of like a snapshot of a moment, is that there's an aristocrat or something like that, and he has some land and it involves a fief. Like, what does that actually kind of mean? Understanding that this varies widely by time and place and stuff like that.
Well, let me take a snapshot from the late 12th and early 13th century. There's a scholar, Theodore Evergates. He has a little book of collected documents on the feudal county of Champagne. And if you look into the property sections there, you will see that, so one of the emblematic things about the form of land that we call the fief is that it's contractual. Like, so there's a document that explains, by the time we're in an era of more written record, there's a document that explains the nature of the duties and obligations on either side. But also you will find documents there where you have allodial land that was converted to fiefs and vice versa. So allodial is freehold, freehold land, what we would think of as kind of just ownership. So you see land switching from one thing to the other sometimes. Owning this kind of land often involved certain rights, rights that were delimited. So in the French context, that might mean that you might have high justice, meaning that you could hold a court. And if somebody was convicted of murder, you could capitally punish them. So high justice is any form of, capital punishment. Could be applied by your court. You may not have high justice. You might just have low justice. So that means that you could apply fines or some bodily harm. But a lot of it was fines. And so, do you have jurisdiction over crime, and then significant crime? Do you just have jurisdiction over property? How does your jurisdiction butt heads with the jurisdiction of the church? Like, clearly the church had jurisdiction over things that were considered moral issues, such as adultery or bigamy. But then there are some liminal issues like wills. Will is a matter of the soul at the time that you're dying, but a will is a property transaction. So those were some of the really debated kind.
I think this is great. So if this fief is passed on and it's a grant to someone about the way that they can hold their property, like one of the things that's often characterized as, like, when we talk about kind of a feudal relation or feudalism again, is reciprocity. So what would, in exchange for getting that land, what would someone owe to the person granting that land?
Well, probably the most emblematic thing would be military service. But by the time you get to high Middle Ages, you can start paying your way out of that.
Sure.
So that you might expect a donation if your daughter was being married from your men. If you're a lord, you could expect people to try to ransom you if you were caught and couldn't get out of prison. Otherwise, it often, came with an ability, perhaps a duty, depending where you are, to hold court for the people on your land. So that would be the serfs or people who had freehold that were renters on your land. So yeah, things like that.
Okay.
I'm sure I'm missing some.
No, of course. But there is kind of a sense of reciprocity, right? Is that as we understand it, is that there is a relationship that's kind of established between the person who is able to give the land and the person who is receiving that land.
That's right. And like, as the landholder, you get to enjoy the fruits of the land. So you basically, the things that it produces are yours, and you can live off of them. You can sell them. You can shuffle them around to get other things, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of what you get as the landholder.
Yeah. And oftentimes, these things, especially, in any period, I think oftentimes people think that the land that somebody might hold, an aristocrat, for example, might be, concentrated, but these things could be kind of widely spread, or lands could be kind of widely spread across Europe or across multiple jurisdictions. And then that's when you get into like really complicated relationships in which you owe, something to the Duke of Aquitaine, but also the Count of Blois, as well as, the Lord of Champagne or something like that. You're right. Like, and then what happens when those guys don't like each other, and, it gets really complicated very quickly sometimes. So, yeah.
Right. Who is the primary lord? Who do you owe stuff after that? And just going back to this kind of land ownership, right? So to turn to the kind of like more economic aspect, like, it's true that the agrarian economy was deeply important to the Middle Ages. And it's also true that there was peasant exploitation. Yes. So Thomas Bisson, read him. Those things are undoubtedly true. But do you need the fief for that? Or do you just need land for much of like human history, honestly? Yeah. And so that's where the concept is a little bit problematic. So there was also an urban economy that was very important and powerful, especially starting the 11th century. So agrarian economy, peasant exploitation, you can easily look at the 12th century, the 17th century, and even the 19th century, and those could be characteristic. So it's not that useful to conflate these economic descriptors with kind of this totalizing term.
Yeah, because when you and I think that's really important to remember too, is that these types of relationships or these types of exploitation oftentimes, right? Like, they exist, yes, in the Middle Ages, but they exist in modernity, early modernity, sometimes, well into, modernity itself, and other types of exploitation, which similar, maybe a little bit different, like existed in antiquity as well. So like what is kind of characteristically necessarily kind of medieval about that? So, and that's what feudalism kind of effaces, or the term kind of can efface at times. So that's a way of kind of transitioning in some ways, because I do want to, talk about modernity itself, is that because this term, like we're kind of hearing it again too, right? Like we're hearing kind of this idea of neo-feudalism, techno-feudalism, stuff like that in today's world. But even before that, right? Like in the, 18th, 19th century, as the term is kind of coming into vogue, it seems to be applied in really interesting ways to understand those contemporary moments of economic and kind of political kind of culture. So what was the attraction, and like why was it so important to modernity, if that makes sense, or modernity's definition of itself?
Well, I mean, it's primarily important as a contrast, right?
Okay.
You noted yourself when we were talking about notions of feudal revolution. I mean, what is more attractive and romantic than completely overthrowing something?
Sure.
And that's part of the
Yeah.
myth of, or, of modernity in various kinds of ways. So it's you might say the linchpin, but it's more like the straw man in some ways that permits us to think the things that we want to think about modern culture, right? So where we had an unequal society. So now I'm thinking of the French Revolution, where we had an unequal society. Now we have a society based on equality, right? And, one of these, in terms of the France context, in terms of these different customs for everyone and different people doing whatever they want with courts, we replace that with modern codes that apply to everyone. Well, not to everyone, they apply to male citizens.
Yeah.
But even if you look at that, the people who composed those codes were old regime lawyers trained in feudal and medieval law. And, a lot of property and family law was just slightly rejiggered, but not terribly different. So that doesn't mean there wasn't change. Of course, we have like a Declaration of Rights of Man that didn't exist before. But I think that just as medievalists have started thinking of kind of slow change over time, modernists may be interested in thinking that way as well, because it more accurately, I think, captures kind of transformations than simply thinking of revolutions. But anyway, going back to the United States that you were asking about, right? It was also partially founded as an anti-feudal project.
Yes.
Like dismantling entails and, which is a form of property that had very specific, the fee tail and the fee simple. And if you ever read Jane Austen novels, right, there's a reason those women can't inherit.
Yeah.
So reasons why it had to kind of transition in a very specific way, usually to first male heir. They were rejecting, entail, primogeniture, hereditary titles, right? All of these things. And it was really important in the elan of revolution to seem absolutely different, But I think there's some really interesting new books coming out by American historians who are really thinking about how these arguments were used at the time of revolution. And here I'm thinking of Robert Raby, Medieval America, a title that you might like specifically. But he basically, argues that various structural components of what you might call the feudal American arrangement before the revolution were maintained after the revolution, despite this myth of success of eradication.
Yeah. And,
the other very interesting book that came out is just couple of years ago, Kedrick Roy's American Dark Age. And, here he really looks at kind of feudal imaginaries. And I use that expression because not like tracking medieval history to modern America, but how people in the 18th and 19th, especially 19th century, were using terms that they associated with the Middle Ages and some of these feudal aspects that we were talking about in order to understand their own society, in order to create like social hierarchies, in order to cement stratification, in order to talk about paternalism, chivalric masculine ideals, mutual obligations, natural hierarchies, a lot of that. And in fact, like drew parallels between themselves and kind of feudal lords. So there's a really important historical component of, this feudal imaginary as it develops in the 18th and 19th century is not just like a theoretical construct to develop economic theory and legal theory, but it's also very much a cultural product, in a similar way as you were mentioning that it is today.
Yeah.
Very much, the cultural imaginary. The history doesn't matter for that cultural imaginary. What matters are, certain symbols, certain tag words that get used and reused. But that's a historical moment. Then the other thing that you mentioned that is really worth discussing is this neo-feudalism and techno-feudalism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's worth mentioning. I mean, I think both the previous example and this one reinforces the one utility of feudalism as a historical concept is this counterpoint to narratives of modernity, right? So feudalism is useful to the extent that it has made 18th century to now, like the societies of the last 3 centuries, think about itself. And neo-feudalism is very much that. And it's used as kind of a diagnostic for capitalism, right?
Sure. One of the things that's always striking about kind of the deployment, or the very recent deployment of terms like techno-feudalism, neo-feudalism, and stuff like that is like, with all the frustrations that, I as a medievalist have with kind of the use of the term and its historical inaccuracies and blah, 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 which may be a separate thing, is that it is at least trying to get people to think, I think you were saying, like outside of capitalism. And the only way, it's interesting to me that the only way they seem to be able to do that is something from the past. It's not a new thing. It's the return of the past in this kind of different guise, right? Like as if the Middle Ages have never kind of left us, but it's always been lurking there somehow.
Yeah, that's a really, I think, important observation, right? That, I mean, it's, first of all, speaking of totalizing frameworks, right? Capitalism and liberalism or neoliberalism, the impossibility of thinking outside the frameworks that we have. So that's really important. And then the other important thing is that, there's a shaming factor, right?
Yes.
So feudalism, like medieval, is meant to shame and to point out certain of these factors that we started speaking about in like the first 5 minutes of this discussion, which is what it's meant to do is shed a light on modern inequality, on social disparity, on growing and increasingly entrenched like wealth gaps, differences, even disconnects between groups that are, it depends who you're reading. Right now I'm thinking of Joel Kotkin's Coming of Neo-Feudalism, where he talks about like clerisy, intellectual elite that's divorced from kind of more popular thought, which I wonder about that a little bit. I think that's a different topic, but I think popular thought is always, one thing. And then kind of scholarly treatments are another thing. So that's a little bit the nature of the beast. But also Jody Dean's Capital's Grave, which is really about class struggle. That's a new economic history, thinking about the current economic moment, no longer about being a battle between democracy and fascism, but this networked global capitalism versus everybody else, right? And everybody else who are renting their homes, who are deeply in debt, right? And kind of what's described as neo-feudalizing tendencies, which is kind of code for, new forms of social domination and like massive inequality.
Yeah.
And so again, like that's not so much about the history that we're talking about, but it's a useful place of thought kind of for the current moment. And similarly with techno-feudalism, which I guess is maybe like a more controversial term than neo-feudalism, but that's really about like the digital capitalism and the Apples and Googles and Metas and Apples, I already said Apple, Amazons of the world, who are no longer kind of competing on an open market, but they're, you might say, controlling digital territories.
Yeah.
Platforms that are essential to people to exist in the world today in a lot of ways. And we kind of depend on it for access, for visibility, and for all of this stuff.
Yeah.
And so we can think about, again, like feudalism as a place of thought to think about modernity and to hold a mirror onto modernity, I think is useful. So in that sense, the kind of privatization of wealth, concentration of wealth, other forms of poverty and dependence. Like, I think that's kind of useful way of looking at things.
Yeah, no, I really like the way that you're kind of framing this now, here at the end, is that feudalism as kind of a term to think with, like as a term invented by modernity to help us understand modernity. Like it has very limited explanatory power for the medieval world, but it has actually quite a bit of explanatory power for how we understand ourselves, both, starting back with Smith, as you mentioned, all the way into the 21st century. And when you have all these different organizations and people and reorganizing society in a way that seems to be in some ways different than what has come before. Maybe it's kind of an extension of, but maybe it's a little bit different. And then beyond that, kind of Silicon Valley, which is the tech bro culture, which is its own kind of new animal that has kind of been unleashed on us, over the last 20 years or 30 years or something like that.
Yeah. So. But I will add to that it's a useful way of holding a mirror, thinking about ourselves, but it also disguises the fact, I think, by primitivizing some of these activities, it disguises the contemporaneity and like deep modernity of those things,
Yeah.
So it's making it like not a thing of the present. And so it's like a weird aberration. And I think that's one of the big mistakes in the last, many decades of thought is that there's, visions of progress that a lot of people are surprised, are being, a little bit, revealed not to exist so much or, but, there's a way in which choosing certain contemporary things and labeling them as things of the past is really to turn a blind eye to the nature of modernity itself.
Yeah. Yeah, we get to shove kind of the stuff that we don't like that's actually really modern and just say it's medieval in some way, right? Like this is an aberration, as you were saying, and it's an intrusion into modernity that should be excised in some way
exactly.
Or at least dealt with in some ways. But
right. Instead of seeing modernity as generative of these things, right? These traditionalisms, these conservatisms, these hierarchies, these, wealth inequalities. Anyway, okay, no, I'm going to stop there because it's going to go on and on.
No, we could go on for a long time, but we are unfortunately, running towards the end of our show. Ada, this has been really wonderful conversation. If people do want to learn more about you or your work, and they have something called the internet, is there a place that they could find you on the internet?
I suppose my faculty website.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, pretty much there, honestly. But okay. I will be updating my Academia EDU page, so perhaps there too.
Okay. All right. Academia.edu, your faculty website. I mean, they'll be able to Google you, and I'm sure, things will come
things
up.
Pop up.
Yes. And, but again, thank you so much for taking the time. This has been, I think the conversation could continue to go on. I think expansively with just the way that we're permeated with variations of the term nowadays. And it's just kind of flooding, not just kind of social media, but just kind of like how we're thinking about what does 21st century kind of society look like nowadays. Feudalism, neo-feudalism, techno-feudalism, variations on those terms seem to be coming back into vogue. So, and lots of stuff, out there to explore, as you've mentioned throughout, lots of books that have been written on this, articles and stuff like that. So
yes, non-comprehensive list.
No, but not by any chance. We don't have, yes, as much as these conversations are delightful and are very much in a college seminar in all the best ways of conversation. So, bibliography would be much more extensive were we to go into it. So anyway, thank you again for joining us. Thank you too to everybody for listening to another episode of American Medieval. We hope to see you again next week. Until then, be good, take care, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks for listening to this episode of American Medieval, a proud member of the Multitude Podcast Collective. I'm your host, Professor Matthew Gabriele, and this episode was edited by Julia Schiaffini. The theme song to American Medieval is from the song Sleeping Bags by OTE. If you'd like to support the show, get ad-free episodes, be inscribed into the Book of Life for being a kind and generous soul, and get some other neat bonus stuff, please visit us at patreon.com/American Medieval. Thanks again for listening. See you all soon.